Imagine waking up one morning to find that the very people meant to protect property values are destroying your life instead. The HOA didn't just hand out petty fines or complain about lawn height. They crossed a line so shocking it left the entire neighborhood whispering. Suddenly, one homeowner's private sanctuary became a battlefield of power, pettiness, and revenge. And when the board thought they had all the control, they never expected the homeowner to fight back in a way that would change everything. What would you do if your own community turned against you? At first, everything felt perfect. The quiet cul-de-sac, the neatly trimmed lawns, the row of identical mailboxes that gave the neighborhood its postcard charm. It was exactly what Thomas and his wife imagined when they bought their dream home. They'd worked for years, saving every penny to escape the cramped apartment where traffic and sirens drowned out their evenings. Here, in this so-called community of harmony, they finally had space to breathe. Neighbors waved when they drove by. Kids played in the cul-de-sac until the streetlights flickered on. Weekends were filled with block parties, garage sales, and the kind of small-town rituals that made the neighborhood feel safe and predictable. For a while, Thomas believed he had found the perfect place to build his family's future. But beneath the manicured lawns and freshly painted fences was something no realtor ever mentioned: the HOA board. On paper, it looked harmless. A group of neighbors who volunteered to keep the community looking nice. They promised consistency, fairness, and order. At first, Thomas didn't think much of it. He paid his dues, attended the occasional meeting, and assumed the rules were merely guidelines to maintain peace. That illusion didn't last long. It began with a letter, just a single sheet of paper slipped into his mailbox with the HOA's official stamp at the top. The tone was polite, almost sterile, but the message was clear. A violation had been noted. Thomas's crime? A garden hose was left coiled beside the garage. Not an eyesore, not a hazard, just a hose visible from the street. He laughed it off at first, thinking it was a mistake. But then came another letter, and another. Each one was sharper than the last, demanding correction and hinting at fines. The board's language grew less neighborly and more legalistic, as though Thomas had committed some serious offense. What unsettled him wasn't just the petty nature of the complaints, but the feeling that someone was watching. Every time he stepped outside, every time he parked his car slightly off-center, he wondered which neighbor had reported him. The sense of community that once felt so warm began to curdle. Conversations with neighbors turned shorter, friendly. Waves turned into suspicious glances. Thomas realized that in this neighborhood, perfection wasn't optional. It was enforced. And those who didn't conform, they were singled out. His wife tried to stay optimistic, brushing it off as just rules that everyone had to follow. But Thomas couldn't shake the unease. Something about the board's persistence felt less like oversight and more like a test, as though they were pushing to see how far they could go before he broke. The garden hose was only the beginning. Soon, new letters appeared citing improper lawn height and unauthorized modifications to his backyard shed. Accusations that were either exaggerated or completely fabricated. And with every warning, the shadow of the HOA loomed larger over his home, until what was once his sanctuary began to feel like contested ground. Thomas didn't know it yet, but the petty fines and constant surveillance were only the first shots fired. What started as a minor inconvenience was about to escalate into a battle that would shake the entire neighborhood and expose just how dangerous power could become when placed in the wrong hands. At first, Thomas thought the HOA's pettiness had limits. A few letters, a warning or two, maybe that was the worst of it. He was wrong. The next violation came in the form of a bright orange notice taped directly to his front door. Failure to comply with HOA guidelines regarding exterior appearance. His supposed crime. A faint patch of brown grass near the corner of his yard. Just a few feet, sun-scorched from a hot week in July. Thomas had been planning to reseed it anyway, but the letter demanded immediate correction or face a $75 fine per day. It was the first time Thomas felt his chest tighten with anger. This wasn't about keeping the neighborhood beautiful. It was about control. He knew it. And deep down, he sensed the board knew it too. Still, he tried to comply. He watered. He reseeded. He spent weekends working under the blazing sun to make every inch of grass look flawless. For a short while, the letters stopped. And Thomas hoped maybe things would calm down. But the silence didn't last. Weeks later, another notice arrived. This time, the HOA claimed his trash cans were improperly stored. They had been tucked neatly along the side of the house, hidden from the street except for a small sliver visible at the edge of the driveway. The fine, $150. Thomas's frustration grew. He drove through the neighborhood, snapping pictures of other homes where trash cans sat openly in plain view, untouched by fines or letters. Why was he being singled out? The answer seemed obvious. Someone on the board had made him a target, and once a target was chosen, the rules no longer applied evenly. The fines snowballed. A supposed oil stain in his driveway, $200. A backyard shed that had not been pre-approved, despite being there before he moved in, $300. Even a seasonal wreath that his wife hung on the front door was flagged as an unapproved decoration. Thomas was hemorrhaging money over fabricated violations. His appeals fell on deaf ears. The board was judge, jury, and executioner, each letter delivered with the cold authority of people who knew they held power no individual homeowner could easily challenge. The pressure seeped into every part of his life. His wife grew anxious, constantly checking the mailbox with dread. Their evenings, once spent laughing on the back porch, turned into tense discussions about finances and strategy. Should they fight the HOA? Should they hire a lawyer? Or should they just pay the fines and keep their heads down? The worst part wasn't the money. It was the feeling of being watched. Thomas began noticing a black SUV idling near the cul-de-sac during the day. Sometimes it was there when he left for work, other times when he returned. Once, late at night, he caught the faint click of a camera shutter from the shadows across the street. Someone wasn't just reporting him. They were documenting his every move. The sense of paranoia gnawed at him. He stopped feeling comfortable in his own yard. Even mowing the lawn felt like an act under surveillance, each movement scrutinized for the next inevitable violation. And then came the meeting. Thomas decided enough was enough. He attended the monthly HOA gathering at the community clubhouse, determined to call out the board for their harassment. Dozens of neighbors filled the room, sipping coffee and whispering among themselves, while the board members sat at a long table, smug and self-assured. When the floor opened for homeowner concerns, Thomas stood. His voice trembled at first, but his frustration quickly sharpened his words. He laid out the evidence. Photos of other homes with visible trash cans, lawns with brown patches, driveways with stains. He pointed to the double standard, the selective enforcement, the targeting. The room grew tense. Some neighbors nodded in quiet agreement, but the board's response was chilling. Compliance with HOA standards is non-negotiable, the president said flatly. If you are unable to meet those standards, perhaps this community is not the right fit for you. It wasn't just dismissal, it was a threat. Move, or we'll make your life miserable, the crowd murmured. Some neighbors avoided Thomas's eyes entirely, afraid to be associated with him. Others whispered support privately afterward, but none dared speak up publicly against the board. That night, Thomas realized just how powerful fear was in a community like this. But he wasn't going to back down. The next morning, a certified letter arrived in the mail. It wasn't a violation notice this time. It was worse. The board was initiating legal action to place a lien on his home for unpaid fines. If the lien remained, they could eventually move to foreclose. Thomas's sanctuary, the house he'd worked his entire life to afford, was now on the line. The emotional weight was crushing. He felt betrayed, trapped, and humiliated all at once. He was no longer just dealing with neighborhood politics. This was warfare disguised in legal paperwork. Desperation pushed him to research. He spent late nights poring over state HOA statutes, homeowner rights forums, and case studies of similar disputes. He discovered stories of families who had lost everything to aggressive HOAs, their homes sold at auction for pennies over fabricated fines. But he also found stories of resistance, homeowners who had fought back and won. That's when Thomas made a decision. He would no longer be reactive. He would fight back on his own terms. He began documenting everything, every letter, every notice, every photo of his property. He filed complaints with the state's Consumer Protection Agency. He contacted an attorney specializing in HOA disputes. And then he uncovered something shocking. Buried deep in the HOA's governing documents was a clause requiring board members to disclose conflicts of interest. Through public records, Thomas discovered that the HOA president, the very man who had dismissed him at the meeting, owned a private landscaping company, a company that, conveniently, was hired by the HOA to maintain community lawns at inflated rates. Suddenly, the aggressive fines against Thomas's yard weren't just about compliance. They were about profit. The discovery lit a fire in him. If the board was abusing power for personal gain, then this wasn't just his fight anymore, it was the entire community's. But exposing them wouldn't be easy. The board had control of the communication channels, the meeting agendas, and even the neighborhood newsletter. One wrong move, and they could bury him further under legal threats and fines. So Thomas crafted a plan. Quietly, he began reaching out to neighbors one by one, sharing what he'd uncovered. At first, most were hesitant, terrified of retaliation. But when he showed them the evidence, the contracts, the inflated invoices, the financial trail, their hesitation shifted to anger. A small but determined group began to form. They met in garages and backyards, away from prying eyes, to discuss strategy. They shared their own stories of fines, intimidation, and harassment. For the first time, Thomas felt the tide turning, but the HOA wasn't about to let go of its grip without a fight. One evening, just days before the next board meeting, Thomas found a notice nailed to his door. It wasn't a violation. It was a summons. The board was calling for a special vote to strip him of community privileges, including access to amenities, and threatening additional legal action if he continued what they described as defamatory activity. The gloves were off. Thomas knew that walking into that meeting could change everything. Either he would be silenced once and for all, or he would expose the corruption that had poisoned the community from within. And as he prepared his evidence and rehearsed his words, one question burned in his mind. Would his neighbors finally stand with him, or would fear keep them silent again? The night of the special HOA meeting felt like walking into enemy territory. Thomas stood at the edge of the community clubhouse, clutching a folder so thick with papers it barely fit under his arm. His wife whispered a few final words of encouragement, but he could feel her hands trembling against his own. They both knew what was at stake: their home, their reputation, even their standing in the neighborhood. The parking lot outside was already overflowing, headlights cutting across the dark as neighbors streamed inside. More people had shown up than Thomas had ever seen at a meeting. The board clearly wanted an audience. They wanted to make an example out of him. Inside, the air buzzed with nervous chatter. Folding chairs lined the walls, every one of them filled, neighbors shoulder to shoulder. At the front sat the HOA board, 5 members in matching polo shirts with the community logo embroidered neatly over their hearts. And in the middle, presiding like a king at his throne, sat the HOA president, the man who had turned Thomas's dream home into a nightmare. The gavel came down hard. "This meeting is now in session." The president's voice boomed with smug authority. He launched immediately into accusations. Thomas had engaged in defamation, spread false claims, and continued to violate community rules. According to the board, his actions had disrupted the peace and unity of the neighborhood. For this, they recommended stripping him of community privileges and advancing legal action to secure payment of fines. Gasps rippled through the room. The board wasn't just trying to fine Thomas anymore. They were trying to destroy him. Thomas stood slowly, the folder heavy in his hands. His voice was steady, but inside his heart hammered like a war drum. He had one chance to turn the tide. "I didn't come here to beg for leniency," he began. "I came here to show you the truth." He opened the folder and spread documents across the podium. Contracts, invoices, and financial records he had gathered through weeks of research. He pointed directly at the president. "This man has been profiting off every single one of us. The landscaping company that services our lawns, he owns it. The inflated invoices you've all been paying for years, they go straight into his pocket. And while he enriches himself, he fines homeowners like me over nonsense. Brown grass, trash cans, decorations. Not because it matters, but because it pads his balance sheet." The room erupted. Whispers surged into heated voices. People leaned forward, grabbing at copies of the documents Thomas held up, faces twisted in shock and anger. The president slammed the gavel, his face flushing red. "Out of order! These accusations are baseless and defamatory." But Thomas wasn't done. He flipped to the next page, a copy of the HOA's bylaws. His finger landed squarely on a clause highlighted in yellow. "Board members are required to disclose conflicts of interest. That's not my opinion. That's your own rule. And failure to do so isn't just a violation. It invalidates every contract you've signed under pretenses." The board members shifted uncomfortably. One leaned back in his chair, suddenly avoiding eye contact with the crowd. Another fiddled nervously with his pen. The cracks in their united front were starting to show. Neighbors who had once stayed silent were now speaking up. "I got fined for the same thing," someone shouted. "Yeah, me too, over my fence." Another chimed in. Voices overlapped, anger spreading like wildfire. The president tried to regain control, pounding the gavel so hard the wood cracked. But his voice was drowned out by the uproar of residents finally realizing they'd been exploited. And then came the moment Thomas had been waiting for. From the back of the room, a neighbor stood up, a retired accountant who had lived in the community for over 20 years. He raised his hand and asked one simple question. "If these accusations are false, why don't you open the books for everyone to see?" The president froze. His lips moved, but no words came out. The silence was deafening. In that instant, every ounce of credibility he had built crumbled before the eyes of the community. Thomas pressed the advantage. He revealed letters from other homeowners who had faced similar harassment. He showed photos of inconsistencies, board members' homes with violations that had gone unpunished. Piece by piece, he dismantled the illusion of fairness the HOA had hidden behind. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone in that room. By the time he finished, the clubhouse had transformed. What began as a tribunal meant to humiliate Thomas had become a trial of the HOA itself. The neighbors who once whispered in fear were now united in outrage, voices rising together against the board that had preyed upon them for years. The president's face was ashen. His hands shook as he tried one final desperate attempt to shut Thomas down. These documents mean nothing. You don't understand the complexities of running a community. Order must be maintained, but the crowd had already made up its mind. Murmurs of resign turned into chants. Chants grew into roars, and for the first time, the board looked out at a sea of homeowners they could no longer control. The gavel pounded one last time, a hollow sound that no one obeyed. The meeting was no longer theirs to run. Thomas felt a rush of vindication unlike anything he had ever known. Weeks of paranoia, months of harassment, all of it had built to this single moment where the truth cut through the lies. He had taken back his voice, and in doing so, he had given the entire neighborhood theirs as well. But just as relief began to wash over him, the president leaned forward, his eyes narrowed to a venomous glare. His words were low, but they carried a sharp edge. This isn't over. The threat hung heavy in the air, chilling the room even as the chants of neighbors swelled around Thomas. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if he had truly won, or had he just provoked a more dangerous fight. The meeting ended in chaos, but the fallout was only just beginning. Neighbors spilled out of the clubhouse, voices raised, papers clutched in their hands. Some spoke in hushed tones of disbelief, while others vented years of pent-up frustration. For the first time in a long time, Thomas felt something shift. The fear that had silenced the community was gone. In its place burned a collective anger and a determination to take back what was theirs. That night, Thomas barely slept. He kept replaying the president's final words in his head. This isn't over. They carried a venom that made his chest tighten with unease. The board had power, resources, and the law at its side. What if they doubled down? What if they tried to bury him in lawsuits? But by morning, the tone of the neighborhood had already changed. People he barely knew knocked on his door to thank him. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now stood shoulder to shoulder with him, recounting their own experiences with the board's harassment. Each story was another piece of evidence, another nail in the coffin of the HOA's credibility. The pressure mounted quickly. Within a week, a group of homeowners petitioned for a special election to remove the current board. State law required only a certain percentage of signatures to trigger a recall, and with the momentum from the explosive meeting, they reached that number in record time. The board tried to stall, citing procedural errors and insufficient documentation, but it was too late. The tide had turned. The residents had tasted what it felt like to resist, and they weren't going back. When the recall meeting finally came, the turnout dwarfed anything the HOA had seen before. Dozens of families showed up, united by frustration, betrayal, and a shared determination to clean house. One by one, votes were cast, and when the tally was announced, the result was undeniable. The president and 2 other board members were removed from their positions effective immediately. The room erupted in cheers. Years of pent-up resentment broke loose in a single wave of celebration. For Thomas, it was vindication. He hadn't just defended his home. He had sparked a movement that freed an entire community from corruption. But victory didn't erase the scars. The weeks that followed were filled with cleanup, both figurative and literal. The ousted Board members left behind a tangled mess of financial mismanagement. Inflated contracts, questionable expenses, and hidden debts came to light as the new interim board began combing through the records. The neighborhood wasn't just emotionally fractured, it was financially vulnerable. Thomas, once reluctant to even attend meetings, found himself pulled into the rebuilding process. His knowledge of the documents, his determination, and his newfound reputation as the man who stood up to corruption made him a natural leader in the reform effort. He didn't want the position, but he also knew walking away would leave the community exposed to the same abuses again. So he stepped up. Together with a handful of dedicated neighbors, Thomas worked to rewrite the HOA bylaws. They imposed stricter transparency rules requiring open books and accessible meeting notes. They capped the board's ability to levy fines without due process. They created conflict of interest disclosures that prevented anyone from profiting off the community in secret. It was tedious, exhausting work, hours of meetings, debates, and revisions, but the difference was night and day. For the first time, residents felt like their voices actually mattered. They weren't just living under rules, they were shaping them. As weeks turned into months, the atmosphere of the neighborhood transformed. Where once there had been suspicion and paranoia, there was now cautious optimism. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down now spoke up freely. Children played outside without parents worrying about violations. Front yards reflected personalities, not just rigid conformity. And slowly, the cul-de-sac began to feel like a community again. But for Thomas, the journey left deeper marks. He couldn't forget the sleepless nights, the mounting fines, the paranoia of being watched. The memory of that black SUV parked outside his home lingered in his mind. Even as life improved, he knew how easily it could all be taken away by the wrong people in power. He carried that lesson with him, not as bitterness, but as resolve. When reporters eventually caught wind of the story, a homeowner exposing a corrupt HOA president profiting off his neighbors, Thomas hesitated at first. Did he really want his life put on display? But after some thought, he agreed to speak, not for his own vindication, but to warn others. His interview spread quickly online, shared by frustrated homeowners across the country. Emails poured in from strangers describing eerily similar experiences: intimidation, harassment, endless fines. Thomas realized his story wasn't unique. It was part of a much larger problem: unchecked power hidden behind the facade of community. That realization changed him. He began volunteering with local homeowner advocacy groups, helping others navigate the legal gray areas that HOAs often exploited. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had been too afraid to speak. The former HOA president? He didn't disappear quietly. Rumors spread of lawsuits threatened, attempts to claw back influence, and even whispers of him trying to form a new neighborhood committee. But with the conflict of interest evidence hanging over his head, his reputation was ruined. His own neighbors no longer trusted him. His business contracts dried up. In the end, the very greed that had fueled his power became the seed of his downfall. For Thomas, the greatest victory wasn't seeing the president fall. It was seeing the neighborhood rise. Families who had once felt powerless now held their heads high. Decisions were debated openly. Disagreements happened, yes, but without fear of retaliation. What had once been a community ruled by silence, and suspicion was now bound by transparency and accountability. Years later, when Thomas looked back, the scars of that battle remained, but so did the lessons. He realized that the true danger of an HOA wasn't in the rules themselves. It was in the hands of those who enforced them. Rules could be fair, or they could be twisted. Power could protect, or it could exploit. The line between harmony and tyranny was thinner than most people ever imagined, and perhaps the most chilling. Truth? None of it would have changed if he hadn't fought back. In the quiet moments, sitting on his back porch, Thomas sometimes asked himself, what if he had stayed silent? What if he had paid the fines, obeyed the petty demands, and kept his head down like so many others? He knew the answer. The abuse would have continued, the president would have grown bolder, and the community would have sunk deeper into fear. But because one man stood up, everything changed. As the sun set over the cul-de-sac, children's laughter echoing in the distance, Thomas finally felt what he had dreamed of years ago when he first bought the house. Peace. Not the false peace of rigid conformity, but the real kind earned through struggle, sacrifice, and courage. And so his story ended, not with bitterness, but with hope. Because for every homeowner watching, his message was clear. You may think you're just one person against a powerful board, against rules written in stone, against a system designed to break you. But power only thrives in silence. The moment you speak, the moment you fight, even if your voice shakes, even if you stand alone, you permit others to do the same, and that is how communities are truly built.